I am a professor, a researcher, a scholar, and also a storyteller, which means that I profess, I do research, I do scholarly work, and I tell stories. I'm a professor of communication, and I teach about solving complex problems. And I must admit that our record, the global record, in terms of solving complex social problems is poor, very poor, actually dismal. And so I must take some responsibility for it. However, today I will make a claim. And I do not make this claim lightly. And the claim that I'm making is that we can significantly improve our record of solving complex social problems. How do we do it? I suggest we do it by what I call flipped thinking, by doing mental somersaults of this kind. This flipped thinking and this flipped way of problem solving is also called by some people as the positive deviance approach, but more on it a little later. First, let me share with you 3 little stories to be on the same page with respect to what I mean by flipped thinking. The subject of my first story is, as you've probably guessed, Abraham Lincoln. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall, and you add a stovepipe hat, and he was a 7-footer. The story goes that during the Civil War, a Union soldier, while shaking hands with the president, the handshake was sort of like this, said, "Oh, Mr. President, you're tall. How tall are you?" And without batting an eyelid, Lincoln says, "Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground." Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground. Now, most of us, problem solvers, experts, measure height in feet and inches. Lincoln flips that thinking and measures height from the perspective of the common ground. Some say that it was this common ground thinking that Lincoln embodied, which someday led to the Emancipation Proclamation. My second story is a deeply personal story. It's about Mother Teresa. Now, when I was 16 years old, when you're 16 years old, you think you can do anything, no? So I wrote a letter to Mother Teresa. I didn't have her address. The envelope said, Mother Teresa, Calcutta. And the letter was 1 page long. And then came a response in Mother's own handwriting. And it was 4 pages long, which started a correspondence relationship. I, of course, became a fan of Mother Teresa from that day on, and I have been collecting stories about her and her life. There's a story of Mother Teresa arriving in Washington, D.C., and being greeted by 1,000 enthusiasts holding placards. And a representative walks up to Mother and says, Mother, we are so happy you're here. Tomorrow we are having a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, and we would like for you to march with us. I am so sorry, my child, she says. If you're going to have a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry. And then a representative says, but why not? You've got to march with us. And she says, if you're going to have a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry. But my child, if you were to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead. So most of us problem solvers are always against something. I'm against teenage pregnancy. I'm against substance abuse. And that's okay. What Mother Teresa teaches us, that it's always a good idea to flip and to ask, what are you for? Because when you pose the for question, you will end up at a very different place. My third story is about Mahatma Gandhi. In India, when we were growing up, we called him Rashtrapita, which means father of the Indian nation. Lovingly, we called him Bapu, father. And the father of the Indian nation, as you can see, traveled not by Indian Force One or Air Force One or even Train Force One. He traveled by train, and he traveled third class. And his fellow Indians would say, Bapu, why do you travel third class? We as a country can do better. And his response was, I travel third class because, as you know, there is no fourth class. I travel third class because, as you know, there is no fourth class. As problem solvers, we often are looking at best practices, the best case scenario, and then we try to replicate it. I think what we learn from Gandhi is of tremendous value to take the perspective of the fourth class, of the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, the ones who are silenced and often overlooked. So, what do we do with these three stories? Well, let's invoke Albert Einstein. What these three flipped stories tell us is that if you can flip your questions as a researcher, if you can ask different questions, questions which are about what's working, what are you for, what's working for the fourth class, for whom things shouldn't be working, you could end up at a very different place. So Albert Einstein said that if I were given an hour, and if my life depended on solving a problem in that 1 hour, I would spend 55 minutes formulating the problem. Because once I had formulated the problem, I would solve it in 5 minutes. So he is encouraging us to pay attention to questions, flipped questions, questions which make us do mental somersaults. So, I am going to take a few social problems which are global social problems. And they're complex social problems because there are no easy solutions. And let's begin with one. Hospital-acquired infections. We usually go to hospitals to get well, to get cured. And I don't know if you know, but right here in the United States, there are 3.5 million hospital-acquired infections each year. There are over 100,000 deaths. It's one of the biggest public health crises because it happens in a hospital, but it's very much under the radar. So in 2005, 6 hospitals in the US decided to ask some flipped questions of this kind. The questions being, are there ordinary patients? I mean, patients usually are the problem in a hospital. They are the ones who carry infectious matter. So they began to ask questions like, are there patients? Chaplains, ordinary nurses who have found demonstrably better ways of preventing the spread of hospital-acquired infections. Now, this is a question that's usually never asked. And when you ask questions like this, you find that, yes, indeed, there is a patient who has figured out. Most patients are helpless, no? I mean, if you're the surgeon, you're examining me, I'm going to be under your scalpel the next day. You do whatever you want. I'm not going to say, hey, doctor, wash your hands. But we found patients who, when a healthcare worker entered the room, would refuse to make eye contact with the healthcare provider if they didn't hear the wash basin run, or if they didn't hear the alcohol dispenser go squish. They would look at the healthcare provider as they walked in and then smile and wink and look away. And then they would look back at them and, with a nudge, point them to the wash basin. So this particular patient had a wisdom, had found a way to solve a problem which most other patients hadn't. We found chaplains. Most chaplains, what do? They take the Bible or whatever, and they take it from one patient to the other, touching their hearts with the Bible. And perhaps they are transmitting a little more than the Word of God, because infectious agents transfer by touch. But we found some chaplains, a few of them, who had plastic covers and who used alcohol swabs and wipes. And their behavior was non-normative. And they had figured out a way, in some ways, to stop and control hospital-acquired infections. We found some nurses who were adept at using their knuckles. They were called knuckle ladies. Knuckles, how do they use their knuckles? Well, you know how we press the elevator button? We usually press it using our fingertips. And if the elevator goes through 14 floors and everybody's touching it, you know what you are doing as a vector of infection transfer. You use your knuckle and you cut the risk of infection transfer by more than 70%. There were some nurses we found who used pendants to carry their hand hygiene with them. Most nurses would look for fixed sanitizing stations, but these nurses carried their Purell bottles in a pendant. Or I guess if you're from Texas, you could even have a makeshift holster. The interesting thing about asking this kind of a question is that you were looking at distributed wisdom. Wisdom that exists not just with experts, but with ordinary people. And this is usually hidden wisdom. There are already some people who figured out a way to solve these problems. So when we found dozens and dozens of these practices in these 6 pilot hospitals and found a way to amplify them, this is what we found. That hospital-acquired infections, a seemingly very complex problem between the year 2005 and 2008, declined in these 6 pilot hospitals by 73%. So we can solve complex social problems by asking questions which we haven't asked before. This approach of flipping questions is often called the positive deviance approach. So the focus here is on what's working, a la Mother Teresa, and what's working for those for whom it shouldn't be working, the 4th class, a la Mahatma Gandhi. And there's a visual illustration of what we mean by the positive deviance approach. There are some people who are out there, hidden from plain view, who have figured out a way to solve these intractably complex social problems. And if we could only find them by asking the kind of questions we've asked, you could find a way to amplify it. Let me give you another example of this. So Denmark. We know about the prison system here in the US. Some people say it's the largest federal housing program, and that's probably true, and sadly. Denmark is a country that can take great pride in terms of the penal system that they have. They have one of the lowest rates of recidivism, or repeat offenders. However, while Denmark has a phenomenal penal system, if you are a guard or an employee in a Danish prison, you are likely to have very quick burnout, you're likely to have very high rates of absenteeism, and you're likely to suffer many violent acts, especially if you're in a maximum security prison, through your contact with inmates. So, very complex problem, no, in some ways, because it's pulling you at different ends. So we asked the following question. Are there certain guards in maximum security prisons who are doing a little better than the others, who face not as much burnout or stress, who are thriving, actually, psychologically, who are not prone to absenteeism, and who have very few violent acts committed against them, because they found, in some ways, the solution. And we found, indeed, there were a few. So what did these guards do? How had they solved the problem? Some of these guards, well, the usual practice was that when a prisoner came to a prison and were enrolled, you would log them, and then you would take them straight where? To their cell. There were some guards, however, who would greet them, shake their hand, look them in the eye, and offer them a tour of the prison. It's like, welcome to my prison. And this is going to be your home, and let me take you and show you where your swimming pool is, and you get an hour, and here's the bubbler, the jacuzzi, and you can play with the bubbles, and here's your dining facility. And you can imagine what that did in terms of how the prisoners responded to them. There were some prison guards who were very mindful of how they entered the prisoners' cells. Ordinarily, if a prisoner rang a buzzer, if you were a guard, you came with your keys and you opened the door as you would, because you had the keys and you had the power to do so. But then there were some guards who would jingle their keys so that the prisoners would know that they are coming, a little advance warning, and who had the courtesy and the respect to knock and ask, "Are you ready? Can I open the door?" This was highly unusual behavior. It was non-normative behavior. And because the prisoners were treated with respect, you can imagine how respectfully they treated these exceptional prison guards. So the wisdom to solve the problem was already there. We also found the normal practice was for prison guards to read the dossier of prisoners when they came in, no? Curiosity. I want to know what maximum security prison, know what this person has done, know what's his record. And you can imagine how reading of a prisoner's record may make you mindful of whom you're walking with. However, there were some prison guards who on their own had decided to not read the dossier. And you can imagine how their behavior was different. If you don't know whom you're walking with, you treat everybody the same. And what does that do in response to how they behave towards you? So my colleagues who did this study talked about how some of these prison guards were actually saving their lives, were thriving mentally, had reduced burnout, because they had decided to kill their curiosity. And by killing their curiosity, they were saving their lives. So, what does this flipped way of thinking, this positive deviance approach, have to do with the border area where we are? And along with several colleagues at UTEP, many of whom are in this room, we have done a few studies by flipping the questions. We know that teenage pregnancy is a big, highly complex social issue on the border, and we have posed a question such as this. Are there young Latina women from poor socioeconomic status whose mother or sister became pregnant when they were a teenager? That's a very high risk factor. Who have been in a relationship but for very strange reasons have been pregnancy-free? And if so, what makes them pregnancy-free? And our findings have been that the mothers of these girls who remain pregnancy-free, despite all the odds, are ones who don't tell their daughter, don't have sex. We know that doesn't work. But they say, Mijita, finish school. Finish school. And the emphasis on finishing school seems to be one that makes a difference, a very positive message then. In closing, we've also asked questions such as, we know diabetes is a big problem. Are there diabetics in El Paso County who are able to effectively control their diabetes with low or no medication and without any surgery, bariatric or otherwise? And the responses, the answers we found is yes, there are some who do so and do so very well, provided they disclose their diagnosis to everybody, whether it's their family, their children, their grandchildren, people in their workforce, their doctors, and so on, so that everybody now can be involved in an ethic of care which otherwise wouldn't be possible. So in closing, I am saying that we can significantly improve our record of solving complex social problems if we flip our questions. So my challenge to each one of you is flip it and look for positive deviance. Thank you.